Let's discuss with ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee and Clinton supporter, Congressman Adam Schiff of California. It's good to have you, Congressman, as always. Tell me why you believe Orlando makes the case that we are a law or some laws away from this never happening again.
Well, look, I think in the wake of Orlando, as we have with every terrorist attack, we try to figure out what more can we do to prevent this. Do we need to make a new investment in intelligence? Do we need to intensify the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria? What steps can we take? But there is one step that has been considered off limits, and that is how do we prevent these terrorists, these homegrown radicals, from getting access to weapons that can kill a lot of people in a short period of time? And I think increasingly Americans are asking, why is it possible if they're considered a terrorism risk, but not to prevent them from getting weapons that can kill just as many people? And that's why I think there's so much attention right now on the legislation that we've tried to pass to have a no-buy list as well as a no-fly list.
Right. Okay. We've been putting a lot of concentration on this, but it's a little bit of a tricky issue to articulate. I don't think what Orlando shows is as simple as a, hey, we need new gun laws, more gun laws. I think this is more about the investigative discretion of the FBI. They're getting a lot of stink put on them, and wrongly here. They did nothing wrong. They are legally not allowed to reach out and flag this type of gun purchase by somebody just because of prior contact. As you point out, Congressman, they can do that with a no-fly list. But there are reasons for this. People who fight for civil liberties, as you do, have put certain restrictions on what the FBI can do in overextending themselves. Second Amendment proponents have handcuffed the FBI here by not allowing a non-conviction, non-adjudication of mental health to be a basis for flagging a gun purchase. So how do we address those issues?
Oh, Chris, you're absolutely right, and I think we put an incredible onus on the FBI because they're doing these investigations in all 50 states. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of suspects, and it's simply the case that with many of these cases, probably in most of these cases, there's not enough evidence to make an arrest. They can't show that the person has provided material support for terrorism. And there may not be a current legal basis to preclude them from getting a weapon. So their hands are often tied, and I think it's, as you point out, unfair to lay this at the feet of the FBI. But I do think that doesn't mean that we're powerless to make changes. And there's sufficient evidence to put someone on a watch list or somebody has been watch listed in the past, then certainly when they go to buy an assault weapon, when there's evidence that the intentions that they may have expressed, the statements they may have made are turning into action, certainly the FBI ought to be alerted so they can resume their investigation, if not a prohibition if someone is on a no-fly list that they get that weapon. But you're right, that's not something that the FBI can do on their own.
And this guy doesn't check any of those boxes. This guy here in Orlando was not under investigation, wasn't on a watch list. He's not somebody who's identified as being an open sympathizer. He didn't even make that level for them because his claims were so bizarre and inconsistent. So it winds up being a little bit more of a dicey proposition. Right now, it's crystal to everybody because we're so angry about what happened. But tomorrow, when the FBI gets back to work, even today, the civil liberties people are saying, whoa, whoa, if you can't make a case, you have to let this people live his or her life. And then you have the Second Amendment proponent saying, whoa, don't get between me and my gun unless you have a conviction. So it almost sounds like, you know, when I heard Secretary Clinton in our interview yesterday, that there's a false enthusiasm for change here. I don't see what's going to change in the wake of this unless that's addressed.
Well, there are due process issues, you're absolutely right, that do need to be addressed. For my part, I think if somebody has been watch listed, even if they're ultimately removed from the watch list, and they go to purchase an assault weapon, that ought to be enough to trigger the FBI to taking another look. Have the sentiments that they expressed, the interest in an attack that didn't motivate into action previously, for which the FBI had to close their case, do they now have reason to reopen that case? I think that's something that the FBI ought to know and be able to use its discretion. When you can make a sufficient showing, though, that someone is a threat, if it's sufficient, for example, and you have enough due process to keep them off a plane,
right,
because they may be able to, be interested in killing the people on that plane, that should also rise the level, I think, of preventing them from getting an assault weapon where they can kill the same number of people.
Another political point is language here. Secretary Clinton said, look, I have no problem calling this extreme Islamism. That's a word we don't hear that often, but the experts recommend it as the most precise analysis of what this perversion of the faith is. She said, I'll say it. The reason I don't say it is not because I'm afraid the way Donald Trump is suggesting. It's because that's what ISIS wants us to say. They want this to be a holy war. That's what their marketing is. I'm not going to give them that. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with the comments the Secretary has made. We don't want to calumnize the entire Muslim population of the world. We don't want to stigmatize Muslims here at home. That's exactly what ISIS would like us to do. It plays into their narrative that we're a war, a clash of civilizations. That's enormously destructive, particularly when we need the help of Muslim communities in the United States to identify people who are at risk of radicalization. And we need the help of Muslim allies in the fight in Iraq and Syria. So I think it's enormously counterproductive. And I'll make one other point, Chris, and that is this. Those that have this fixation on the language ought to be able to say why, if we use the term that they like, that calls for some kind of a different policy. And they've never made that step forward. In other words, they can take the semantic argument, but they don't say if you call it what we think you should call it, it leads to a different strategy or a different approach, because basically they have no different approach to offer.
Interesting. Congressman, thank you very much for having the conversation today. This will continue because no change happens quickly, if at all.